At the start of the 19th century, Captain Meriwether Lewis and Second Lieutenant William Clark embarked on one of the most important expeditions in American history. But the story of their difficult adventure is not for the faint of heart. One of their companions, Sacagawea, was in terrible pain during the Lewis and Clark expedition, and scholars recently uncovered the horrific reason why. Before we can dive into the details of the Lewis and Clark expedition, we must first look at its roots. Why was this expedition commissioned in the first place? In 1803, the United States changed in a dramatic way. It bought the territory of Louisiana from the French First Republic, which at the time was under the leadership of one Napoleon Bonaparte. This became known as the Louisiana Purchase. What this meant was that there was a lot of new land to explore. However, the cogs in President Thomas Jefferson's mind had begun turning long before the purchase expedition was, for Jefferson, the underlying reasons for this expedition were quite complex. Of course, one of the main goals was to map out the most efficient course across the western part of the continent toward the Pacific Ocean. But the spirit of competition also lit a fire of urgency in America's belly. This campaign would also allow the U.S. to lay claim to territory, ideally before any European competitors tried to assert their own dominance in new lands. However, these weren't the only motivations for the expedition. On top of exploring this new territory, the expedition was also intended to collect important information about the land, including geography, topography, and biodiversity. All of this important data would be meticulously noted in logs, maps, and illustrations. But perhaps one of the most important details had everything to do with the Native American tribes that occupied these lands first. Though not as important as discovering an all-water route along the Missouri River, Jefferson also expected the campaign to engage with a variety of Native American tribes, some of whom had never even encountered the American settlers before and secured trade relations with them. But as we'll eventually see, this was quite the tall order. At the very beginning of 1803, Jefferson set the wheels in motion by sending a secret message to the U.S. Congress detailing the proposition for this specific expedition. The following month, the Senate and the House gave their seal of approval, and the plans for the campaign began rolling out in earnest. Jefferson appointed Army Captain Meriwether Lewis as the leader of the Corps of Discovery. Following this, Lewis brought William Clark on board as his co-leader. They would eventually be joined by a crew of about 40 men. However, they weren't quite ready to start their adventure just yet. Jefferson wanted to ensure that the leader of this expedition was prepared for whatever challenges the future and other such skills. However, this was not to say that Lewis wasn't already an incredibly bright man. After all, there was a reason Jefferson had selected him in the first place. Referencing his decision to appoint Lewis, Jefferson shared, "It was impossible to find a character who, to a complete science in botany, natural history, mineralogy, and astronomy joined the firmness of constitution and character, prudence, habits adapted to the woods, and the familiarity with the Indian manners and character requisite for this undertaking. All the latter qualifications Captain Lewis has." Things moved quite quickly in 1803, and by the end of the summer, the keelboat intended to kick off this venture was finally ready. As the vessel was constructed in Pittsburgh, this was where Lewis met a very important member of the team. On top of readying the boat, Lewis procured the cherry on top, a Newfoundland dog named Seaman. With a reputation for being excellent swimmers, Newfoundland dogs were known to be brought aboard fishing vessels. In fact, they could also be a life-saving asset, helping out in the event of a water rescue. But that wasn't all. During the expedition, Seaman would inevitably earn his spot as an important member of the crew, accompanying the men on hunting missions. If they ever came face to face with a dangerous animal, such as a bear, Seaman would be at the very least one line of defense. Little did Lewis know at the time, Seaman would be the only furry pet to see this expedition to the very end. In October 3, Lewis and the keelboat arrived in Louisville, Kentucky to join forces with his co-leader, William Clark. But it wasn't until the next year that the Corps of Discovery finally kicked off their expedition. For the duration of the winter months, they stayed somewhere very special. Close to what we know today as Wood River, Illinois, the crew stayed at Camp Dubois, a military camp that they called home, for several months as they awaited the official beginning of the Lewis and Clark expedition. But when that fateful day finally arrived, they were completely prepared. The expedition certainly thought of everything. For instance, the men were equipped with silver medals made by the U.S. Mint. These medals not only boasted Thomas Jefferson's likeness, but also bore an important message, one of peace and fellowship. They were to present these peace medals to the various Native American tribes they were to encounter on their journey, hoping to foster amicable trade relationships. Of course, not all their provisions came with such a positive message. Peace medals were one thing, but the expedition also made sure to ready themselves on the weapons front: flintlock firearms, rifles, and blades. Other essentials included cartography and blacksmithing equipment, as well as medical supplies, flags, and gifts. On May 4, the Lewis and Clark expedition finally began moving up the Missouri River, leaving Camp Dubois and staying briefly in the settlement of St. Charles, Missouri. But their adventure didn't exactly kick off smoothly. Headed for the Rockies, the men had to face the turbulence of the Missouri River. The current was their worst enemy, and while the keelboat sails sometimes worked, the crew often had to put in some serious hard labor, even pushing or rowing the boat at times. However, it wasn't until a few months into the expedition that a real tragedy struck. On August 20th, 1804, one of the first men to join the Corps of Discovery met a devastating end. Sergeant Charles Floyd perished from what was likely severe appendicitis. The team buried his body in what we know today as Sioux City, Iowa, and even named the nearby river after him. But there were more challenges to come. Dealing with the Native American tribes and making keen observations about the way of life was one of the expedition's goals. As a colonizing force, they believed that all of the land in the Northwest belonged to the United States government, and it was part of their mission to communicate this to the tribes, but they did so in a shocking way. The expedition had to make the tribes understand that they had a new sovereign in George Washington, or quote-unquote their great father. However, the humbling reality of it all was that the Lewis and Clark expedition would likely have failed if it weren't for the help of the Native American tribes that they encountered. The team had the Native Americans to thank for their survival, especially in the face of vicious winter months and the daunting challenge of navigating the Rocky Mountains. But these weren't the only things they relied on them for. Their relations with as many as 24 Native American groups brought them into contact with people who knew the surrounding wilderness like the back of their hands and could provide them with much-needed food. This allowed them to dodge the threat of starvation. However, there was always the possibility of meeting with a defensive and even dangerous native tribe. The expedition wanted to avoid conflict as much as possible. Therefore, they packed gifts, using them as peaceful offerings when entering into negotiations with the Native American chiefs. These included objects like ribbons, mirrors, needles, and medals, among other things. Though many of the tribes were very receptive and amiable, there was one unforgettable encounter. On September 4, the expedition came into contact with the Teton Sioux tribe, also known as the Lakota people. Their chiefs at the time were Black Buffalo and Tortohungar, who is also referred to as the Partisan. This time things got shockingly hostile. The Lakota people had 7 tribes and a scary reputation among foreigners who had traveled down the Missouri River. Before allowing strangers into their lands and safe passage, they required some kind of tribute or gifts. However, when the group first met with the chiefs, they made a dire mistake. Unfortunately, Captain Lewis accidentally insulted Tortohanger. Lewis immediately offered up some gifts, which enraged the chief. But this wasn't the only slip-up. By a cruel stroke of fate, the expedition's Sioux language interpreter was missing from these negotiations, preoccupied with a different tribe. Therefore, communication between both parties was extremely rocky, to say the least. To make matters worse, the Lakota chiefs were not pleased with the gifts presented by the expedition. They wanted more gifts for their warriors, but not just any gift. It quickly became clear what kind of gift the partisan tribe had in mind when one of its warriors began to handle the expedition's boat. That's when the growing tension reached a breaking point. Lewis responded by going on the defense, even threatening to use arms. Similarly, Captain Clark drew his sword ready to engage in combat. This could have easily escalated into a bloody battle, but luck was on their side. Thankfully, Black Buffalo called off his warriors and they retreated. Following this close call, things started looking up. After giving the tribe satisfactory gifts, including a bottle of whiskey and tobacco, the expedition was finally able to continue on their journey. Of course, unfortunately, the men did not leave with the most positive opinion of the Lakota people. Writing about their troubles with this particular tribe, Clark had some fighting words for them. He referred to them as warlike and the vilest miscreants of the savage race. In November of 1804, the Corps of Discovery located the perfect place to hunker down for the winter. They built Fort Mandan across the river from a Mandan village. But this wasn't all they had to do. The group also needed to recruit a new member, an interpreter who would be able to negotiate with the tribal nations come spring. After interviewing a number of trappers, they settled on a man named Toussaint Charbonneau. Charbonneau claimed he was fluent in multiple languages, and he also came with a bonus asset. His pregnant wife was a Native American who knew how to speak Shoshone. Her name was Sacagawea. Now, it should be mentioned that her name is also pronounced Sacagawea or Sacagawea, depending on the source. But for the purposes of this video, we will pronounce it as Sacagawea. Just a few weeks after joining the expedition, on February 5, Sacagawea's labor pains began. But she had a difficult time. To help with the birth, her husband came up with a bizarre idea. Charbonneau thought that a concoction made with a rattlesnake's rattle would help Sacagawea's labor. And lo and behold, Captain Lewis just happened to have this special ingredient on hand. Not long after the struggling mother ingested this potion, the baby finally made his grand appearance, a boy named Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau. Little did the crew know at the time, but this young mother would prove to be a powerful asset to the expedition. In April of that year, the expedition packed up and set off once more. But once again, they faced an aggressive current. The boat often had to be dragged forward by the men as they moved forward along the riverbanks. However, the next month, a near disaster came to pass. On May 5, one of the boats capsized, causing some very valuable objects to tumble out of it, important records and journals. However, there was one hero who came to the rescue, none other than Sacagawea. It was Sacagawea who scooped up those records before they were lost forever. The commanders were impressed by how she'd sprung so readily into action. Just 6 days later, they rewarded her with a special honor, naming the very river after her. But this wouldn't be the last time she saved the day. In August 5, the Corps of Discovery met with the Shoshone tribe. This was territory Sacagawea knew well, as this is where she came from. Therefore, it was Sacagawea who translated for the team as they negotiated a special trade of horses in exchange for the right to cross the Rocky Mountains. This led to an unbelievable surprise. Turns out the leader of this Shoshone tribe just so happened to be Sacagawea's brother Camawait. On top of being a translator, the fact that Sacagawea was a part of the expedition signaled to the other tribes that the crew meant no harm. This was because warring indigenous parties would never have included an indigenous mother and child. Among the Corps of Discovery, Sacagawea became known as Janie, nicknamed as such by Clark. In fact, Clark had such a soft spot for her. He even wanted to provide her son with an education. However, Sacagawea wasn't the only unique member of the crew. Clark brought his own enslaved worker along with the Lewis and Clark expedition, a black man named York. And just like Sacagawea, he was an essential part of the expedition's overall success. To the Native Americans, York was a downright curiosity. They had never laid eyes on a black man before, and his presence was a great source of interest for them. He was also a very strong member of the crew who helped with manual labor and went on hunting missions for the expedition. But though he did remarkable work, Captain Clark did nothing to repay him. When the expedition eventually came to an end, members of the Corps of Discovery reaped the rewards of their accomplishments. Many of them became owners of hundreds of acres of land and received high payment for their services. But how Clark treated York, to put it simply, was despicable. Not only did York receive no form of payment, but Clark didn't even give him his freedom. To add insult to injury, the captain went even further, only permitting York to visit his wife for a short time before sending him to Missouri. And tragically, his life didn't really improve from there. Sadly, York probably never saw his wife again after their brief interlude. What's more, a decade after the Lewis and Clark expedition wrapped up, York was still in bondage and serving the Clark family. Now, the Corps of Discovery was not an abstinent bunch. Intimate relations with Native American women were actually very common among the group. However, this didn't come without its consequences. Because foreign travelers from Britain and France had spread venereal diseases among the Native American tribes, the Corps of Discovery became vulnerable to picking up such afflictions as syphilis and gonorrhea. Unfortunately, these diseases were not curable at the time, and Captain Lewis and Captain Clark could only treat their infected men with what they stocked with their medical cabinet, which was usually mercury pills. And unfortunately, not even the beloved Sacagawea was spared from these afflictions. Scholars recently uncovered that she likely had gonorrhea, a disease most likely given to her by her husband, Toussaint Charbonneau. It is also the probable explanation for why she experienced a terrifying illness during the summer of 1805. Just a few months before they reached the Shoshone Territory, Sacagawea began feeling terribly unwell. Her symptoms included a fever, breathing issues, and a weak pulse. It was also said that she had an alarming twitching of her fingers and arms. Medical historians have since suggested that her severe illness could have been caused by chronic inflammatory disease or gonorrhea. Thankfully, she managed to survive. The Lewis and Clark expedition struggled to make it through the Rocky Mountains, with their food rations running dangerously low. Once again, Sacagawea helped out when they finally made it to a more clement area. The arduous journey over the Rocky Mountains completely drained the men. To help them recover their strength, Sacagawea helped the crew search for camas roots, which she then cooked for their meals. Somehow, she had even more to give than that. When the expedition reached the Pacific coast, they came upon an important trading opportunity at the mouth of the Columbia River. They found the perfect gift for President Thomas Jefferson, a fur robe. It was Sacagawea who offered up a tradable piece of her own, a beaded belt, so that they could secure the robe for Jefferson. On November 5, the Lewis and Clark expedition saw their ultimate goal shining on the horizon, the Pacific Ocean. 2 weeks later, they finally made it just in time for another harsh winter. Camped on the north side of the Columbia River, the group faced the threat of starvation once again. Unfortunately, The elks had made off into the mountains and could no longer be hunted. With their finances also dwindling, they couldn't even turn to the tribes for assistance. Therefore, in order to survive the winter, the expedition had to switch things up and set up camp on the south side of the river instead. It became known as Fort Clatsop. When spring finally arrived, it was time to return home. The Corps of Discovery traveled by canoe and by foot, setting off on March 6. But though their mission was a success, fate still had some twists in store for them. On July 3rd, the team made the decision to split up. This way Captain Lewis could visit the Marias River, while Captain Clark ended up crossing the Crow tribe's land. Both captains found themselves in scary situations. Captain Lewis only had a team of 4 men, and when they met some members of the Blackfeet Nation, their explorations took a dark turn. As darkness fell, some of the Blackfeet men attempted to pilfer their arms, and a fight broke out. The consequences were harrowing. 2 of the Blackfeet men had lost their lives during the altercation. While on the Crow tribe's land, Clark made a wild discovery. Half of their horses had mysteriously vanished. Even more curious was the fact that they had not witnessed anyone from the Crow tribe in the vicinity. When the 2 finally reunited on August 11th, there was one more dramatic event to round off their expedition. The Lewis and Clark expedition really ended things with a bang. When Lewis's group rejoined Clark's, one of Clark's men made an awful mistake. Thinking that Lewis was an elk, Hunter Pierre Crouzat accidentally took aim at his own captain and pulled the trigger. But thankfully, in a stroke of luck, the bullet only hit Lewis in the thigh. Now, following the Missouri River, it was time to bring this expedition to an end. On September 6, they finally set foot in St. Louis. The mission was over, and they had accomplished everything they had set out to do. Welcome back as heroes whose tale would be taught in American schools for centuries to come. That wraps up this journey. Thanks for watching Tales That Tell. Like and subscribe to uncover more of the world's best-kept secrets.